What we have here are two very ancient graves. Both of them look like they come from the exact same place, but they do not. One of them is in more of the Egyptian regions, and that's the one with ginger, the smaller image. The larger image represents Kerma, and you can see that the thing they have in common are these beakers with black tops on them. Now, I've said this before, but we don't have to talk about that. What we have to talk about is how far south did this go? Remember, Nubia for the Egyptians, for the most part, is still within the country of Egypt today. So a lot of people, when they think Nubia, they think somewhere deep in Africa, but actually Nubia started in the country that is Egypt. Aswan pretty much represents the last part geographically that represents pharaonic Egypt. Below that would be Nubia. So, in other words, starting from Aswan down and even to the left of Aswan, so on the same line going down, all of that would be considered Nubian territory, even though it's not technically in Sudan today. And of course, this should be obvious to us because just because the borders have changed in the modern world doesn't mean that they were the same back then. And so, if we look at the monuments that are in between Sudan and Aswan, what you will find is a whole bunch of Egyptian stuff there. And even if you go lower to the Sudanese plains, you will still find Egyptian things. And this is why I did that video where I track going down the Nile to show that as far low as you can go, the Egyptians still had influence all the way down to some of the lowest parts of Sudan, which today we would think has nothing to do with Egypt. But if this is Nubian territory, then where lies Upper and Lower Egypt? If this is not the territories that we were talking about when we talk about the split between the upper and lower parts of Egypt, then what are we talking about when we say the split between Upper and Lower Egypt? Because remember, some people say Upper Egypt was where the darker skinned people would have been located. Well, let's think about it for a second. All we know about Egypt is that today the borders have changed. We know also that Upper and Lower Egypt has changed. So Upper Egypt is south and Lower Egypt is north. And we also know that they transported tons of people from other places in order to work in those locations. One of the groups being cops, not working in Nubia, but working in Upper Egypt, and then eventually the entire continent of Egypt, or the entire country of Egypt. Okay, so now taking that, let's look where Upper Egypt would be, because Upper Egypt is the place where they allege would be the darker skinned people. What we will avoid doing is using maps that have already gotten writing on it, but instead base a new map on the writings of where certain locations in Upper Egypt would be. As you can see with these two maps, they put Upper Egypt a bit too low in the other one, and the other one they put it, I would say, in a more precise location. The one in green is the one that's more precise, but you can see that Upper Egypt in this place would leave very little space for Lower Egypt, which makes sense. Now, we know that Lower Egypt had the Delta, and the Delta is that little part over there that joins with the Siwa Oasis in Asia. And of course, we have Heliopolis, Memphis, and the Giza Pyramids. This source comes from the University College of London. And what we have here is a wooden writing board, and it was mixed together in getting the understandings of the tale of Senuha. Remember, the tale of Senuha mentions Abu in Upper Egypt, and it also mentions the Delta in Lower Egypt. So as we read, it says, upper right edge of a writing board covered with plaster, extremely fragile, with a loss of plaster from most of the surface. Enough survives of 3 lines of hieratic writing on better preserved side to identify contents as the openings of the literature composition known in Egyptology as the Satire of Trades, the teaching written by the man of Charu or Dao's son Keti for his son Pepi when he sailed south to the residence to place him in the writing classroom among the children. So all we have to do is figure out where are these places that are being mentioned in this satire of trades, which is a great place to start because trade means there's going to be a lot of locations mentioned. So, of course, in this introduction, it's written that one of the people comes from, as we read, the teaching written by the man of Charu. Now, Charu can be spelt in different ways: Tharu, Tyaru, or Tjaru. It's only a few of the ways that it can be spelled, but that's the important ones that you usually see. Now, what's the significance of this place? Well, besides just trade, it's mentioned in the Armana letters. Though we could easily look it up, clearly Charu lies in between Asia and the regions of Egypt, and this Charu is sometimes called a gateway between the Sinai areas and Egypt. And the reason why this is important is because this gateway had many translations or many writings that come from different languages, and one of them is from the Amarna letters, of course, and the Amarna letters talk about the trade between Akhenaten's family and the I forgot what they were called now, the people who were in Asia at the time, and these people from Asia, if my memory serves me well, are the people who complained that Akhenaten's father was giving better trade than he was, and that he used to give tribute to the Asiatics, but then the Asiatics lost are losing favor with him because firstly they give him women which are undesirable, and then they give him very little gold compared to what they used to give in the past. And then, of course, slowly but surely, this deteriorates. Not important. The part that's important is that Charu is right there in the middle, breaking the half between Asia and Egypt, or Asia and Africa. The Sinai has always belonged to Egypt, and its proximity to Israel has led people to believe that a lot of the people of Israel, ancient Israel, were probably stowaways or leftovers from the formations of the ancient Egyptians, and probably even later provided people. And remember, there were even Nubians who were stationed in Gaza and in the Sinai regions. And the Sinai was also used as a prison where people were exiled to that location and weren't allowed to leave. And so having to start with this very location is interesting. Of course, this is supposed to be about Upper Egypt, so let's leave these Asiatic regions and leave these two sources because these two sources tell us more about the Asiatic regions, which I probably should do a video on that because they have a lot of names that we don't use today, like the Babylonian Gezra, which is used for the Gezra region, in Babylus or Babylon, and this writing, this correspondence between these two people or these two peoples will come in handy later, but not yet because it's mainly to do with the Asian trade, which, by the way, undermines this idea that ancient Egyptians had no access to Asians. They did, but of course, the way they did was, again, that gate. It wasn't a free for all. People didn't just come in. Another interest is the Karga oasis. The Karga oasis represents another fusion between Nubia and Egypt. Now, the interesting thing about this is that we see people like Herodotus and even further people mentioning it as a great mixing area between the Nubians and the ancient Egyptians. In fact, this is one of the spots that I think the Ammonians are mentioned. The Ammonians, of course, being the earlier people described by Herodotus as a fusion between the Egyptians and the Nubians. Now, we could just move on from El Karga, but the reason why, or the Karga Oasis, the reason why I don't want to do that necessarily is because there's a lot of lessons that this area is going to teach us if we look into ancient Egypt. Remember, ancient Egypt was colonized several of times, which means that the people of ancient Egypt, even though their monuments stand, it's odd to find no occurrences of later interruptions. So people don't actually know this. There's a lot of Roman monuments in ancient or in Egypt. There's a lot of Roman monuments. There's a lot of Greco-Roman monuments. There's a lot of Arab monuments. There's a lot of Christian monuments, and there's all kinds of stuff like that. And in this area, it's probably the most easiest to find, and actually was considered one of the busiest places in ancient Egypt and later times, obviously. Right next to that, we have the Dakhla or Dakhla Oasis. And this oasis is interesting because it was located a little far out from certain regions, and one of those regions that it was away from is where the papyrus was made and grown. And so we find a lot of clay tablets. Now, there's something interesting about this because, of course, we know that clay tablets were used majority by Sumerians, and Sumerians used these clay tablets to write with, which is why some people have made the comparison that these Dakhla tablets might have been from Sumerians. But there's a couple problems. Even though they used a stylus, which what else would you use if you use a clay tablet? The way they used the stylus had nothing to do with how Sumerians used it. Sumerians would put imprints, which is why they use so many straight lines and triangle like lines, whereas these people were pretty much writing on the clay tablet, which is why we still have a lot of their writing. It wasn't papyrus, so it's not going to go away easily. And we have a lot of writing from back then, even though it's small fragments. Now, the question you should probably ask yourself is, if Nubians had so much access to ancient Egypt, then how come there was the limitations of cross pollination was there? How come they weren't just the exact same place? I mean, they had so much in common in terms of region. Why wouldn't they just be the exact same culture? Well, it's hard to say that they were completely different cultures. And in fact, the parts that were exactly the same are the biggest problems. Because, again, like I said, we find ancient Egyptians behaving like the Nubians, as I've shown you with those hand fans, the clothing they wear, and all the other stuff. And then we find Nubians behaving like Egyptians. But here's the problem: these Nubians build a temple in Nubia, Egypt, modern day Egypt, but Nubia, and then they work the temple and everything, and then people today come and say they're just Egyptians. But you can't do that because we have proof that they were Nubians. But they're Egyptians, right? But they're Nubians. Which one are they? We know that, let's take one person for example. During the reign of Akhenaten, we know that the Egyptians built a temple in the region, or built a religious temple in the region of Nubia, and the wife of Akhenaten was praised in that temple. But was she praised by Nubians or Egyptians? Technically, they were Egyptian because they belonged to the state of Egypt, but they were Nubian according to the writings. So, how exactly will you separate this? The only way you can separate it is if you're forcing some kind of separation. The Nubians, I mean, for a large part of their history, were Egyptians. And so calling them Nubians is kind of weird. Now, having said that, we can see here that carrying gold are Nubians, and they're clearly drawn in such a way to suggest that they are different than the ancient Egyptians, even though they're wearing ancient Egyptian clothing. But the stuff they're holding and giving to the ancient Egyptians tells us a couple things. One, it tells us that they were up, they had gold to the highest level, which is why they are always depicted as giving gold to the ancient Egyptians. You almost never see it the other way around, where ancient Egyptians, even when they're colonized, they don't give gold back to the Nubians because gold is everywhere, or at least it's everywhere in the minds of the Nubian territories. Now, of course, these cultures, sometimes it strikes me as like the new word Nubian and the word Egyptian seems to be a word that means outside of our culture. So the Nubians who would call the Egyptians Egyptians, which that's not the word they would use, but the Nubians that would call the Egyptians Egyptians would be referring to people who are just outside of their culture to the north, and the Egyptians would be calling people that who are just outside of their culture to the south. And when I say just outside of their culture, I mean slightly, in the same way that people from some Berbers would consider other Berbers to be just outside of their culture, but really it's all the same culture. As we saw with those early graves that I showed you, they stem from the same place. And remember, linen, cotton, all of that stuff, a lot of it was processed first in the Nubian regions and even planted by the Nubians before it makes its way. The hairstyles obviously are the same. Everything is basically the same, but there is this slight separation between the two areas, and a lot of it I think is political more than it has to do with like a definite state. Like these people are definitely Nubians. Now, this is logical even if you consider the people of the north to be, okay, not the people of the north, but let's say the Asians. Let's say you think that the Asians are the real ancient Egyptians. Still, there would be a separation from the ancient Egyptians between themselves and the other Asiatics. And why would there be this separation? Because civilization wise, they consider themselves different. But obviously, the Asiatic regions are not known to be written as a twin location with Egypt. Because again, in the Bible, you'll find it saying stuff like Egypt, the glory, and Nubia, its expectation. and you'll find the Greeks writing Egypt and Nubia together. They'll write separately that one is Nubia and one is Egypt, but they'll write them together. They almost never write any Asian land with Egypt together. Now, given that a lot of the locations that would be considered Nubia have been evacuated by Nubians today, we should easily know that because, okay, locations that were Nubian have been evacuated, we should know that that means other places that were Egyptian were also evacuated, removed, and put in with a completely new, different type of people. Remember, there was also still the Beja and stuff, so it's not like there was nobody. But I did watch a documentary that sort of suggested that the Nubians that are in Egypt today came from, I think they said, the 60s, when there was some big problem in Nubia and then they moved in, but that's not true. Nubians have been in Egypt since the beginning of Egypt, and not in, I don't mean in Sudan, I mean in Egypt, like almost halfway to the top of Egypt in big populations, which by the way means that they influenced their culture too much. Now, there is something that always confuses me about Sudan, because Sudan has this large history of modernization, of having giant buildings, Egyptian buildings, all these things going down. Why is it that there's so many tribes in Sudan? How come in Sudan they haven't thrown away, they, by the time the Arabs got there, you would have expected that they would have been 100% just a civilization living on bricks and whatever. I actually don't know the answer for this. I don't understand why, even though they had so much access to empire and everything, that they still sort of behave and live like the people who lived thousands of years before dynastic Egypt. And sometimes I think that's the real divide, the mentality between those who want to progress, quote unquote, into those type of civilizations, and those who wanted to live in a, what we might call, a more modern type of way, versus those who wanted to live in an prehistoric type of way. And maybe that divide was more important than race or anything else. The Nubians are something else. They are giants in more than one way. They obviously filled the armies of the ancient Egyptians, probably due to their giant bodies. But remember as well that wrestling was introduced to Egypt by these Nubians, and of course, because of the ridiculously large bodies of the Sudanese people, it must have been more entertaining than normal. Almost like watching a basketball match today, where you're not really trying to watch normal people play basketball as much as you want to watch, I don't know, peak people. I guess that's what you could call them. There's something weird going on in Sudan. There's something weird going on in Egypt, and it's hard to explain. In the temple of Horemheb, we have clear depictions of Nubian women drawn in such a way that, it's like, it feels too modern. Honestly, it feels like this is like a picture of something someone I would see draw on the streets, sort of depicting Africa today, or the African tribes today. Something strange about this image. But this temple that is, I say just above, but it's a distance away, but just above Aswan, brings us to another location in which, of course, Nubians would have been driven to these regions via trade, work, all kinds of things. And I remember someone talk about that Nubian wrestlers and Nubian dancers and all that other stuff, those aren't slaves. Remember that. So when you see them being depicted in temples, we're not talking about slaves, we're talking about actual Nubians. And no matter what the ancient Egyptians would have looked like, they would have fused with these people. I mean, you don't bring a bunch of females to your location and then just, yeah, they're just going to dance and then go home. It's not exactly how things work. And you can see the way they depicted here. They're depicted with the color red, not with the color dark black as they usually are. But you can see the patterns that they wear are animal print, which is typical. I love the carry bag thing on their back because a lot of people told there was somewhere written that African women learned that from Japan. And I remember thinking in my head, really? Tying a kid behind your back is something that you have to learn from another civilization? That seems like it's like the most basic thing that human beings did as soon as they had anything to tie someone behind their back. I do not believe the Africans invented it and then it shipped around the world. I think lots of tribes invented tying your kid behind your back, but I did read that somewhere. But if you lived in ancient Egypt, before you could get to that temple, you would have to run into another temple, the Komombo temple. And this Komombo temple has been written by many historians and in the past, obviously, that it was the sort of blockade or the way through or the monopoly. That's the word I'm looking for. The monopoly going from this temple to others upwards, trading with Nubia. And I want to emphasize that again, the trade with Nubia. I want to emphasize that again. Not slaves, not, war, not conquer and conquered, but trade, but good work, good, honest work, instant trade. Now, again, they had trade with Asiatics. It's not like it didn't happen. But look at the difference between Asiatics who are outside of Egypt and Nubians who are inside the modern country of Egypt. When thinking about the actual language that these people would have spoken, it's actually interesting to think back in the days, like what language would they have spoken? Would it have been a pure ancient Egyptian language? Would it have been something between the ancient Egyptian language and the Nilotic languages or something else? And the answer is probably something else because there are people who come from these quote unquote Nilotic regions who actually speak Afro-Asiatic languages, namely the Cushitic languages, like the Beja people. And I think that's actually the languages that would have been popular. Obviously, there's Old Nubian that would have also been popular, but I think the Cushitic languages would have been something used a lot back in the day, which is probably why there's a lot of similarities, especially in trade words, which I'll do a video on that between the words that have to do with trading and non-trading. Of course, there's the interesting thing about the scars on the face that shows that these people. This is actually, in my opinion, what ancient Egyptians probably look like. This woman over here. When I get a little bit more organized and when I gather my thoughts better, I'm gonna make a repeat of this video, but more organized, probably with a little bit of drawings and stuff like that. But just for now, I just wanted to give an introduction, a small introduction to the various places that are in Egypt and the fact that those places had always had contact with Nubians and that the Nubians were not outside of Egypt but inside the country of Egypt, unlike other people who claim even the Libyans are not necessarily outside of Egypt, but that's for another day.